Nobody on Flight 447 knew the quiet blonde woman in seat 14F had 17 kills and flew F-22 Raptors. They thought she was just another regular military pilot heading overseas. But when the captain collapsed and 4 Russian fighters hunted their plane over the Atlantic, she'd have to do something absolutely crazy to save everyone aboard. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Flight Global Atlantic 447 departed from Joint Base Andrews at 1400 hours on a crisp October afternoon. The Boeing 777-300ER carrying 317 passengers and 14 crew members across the Atlantic toward Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The manifest listed military personnel rotating between assignments, defense contractors heading to NATO briefings, and a handful of civilian families connected to overseas postings. The flight plan showed 6 hours and 42 minutes of ocean crossing, standard routing that would take them over Newfoundland before pushing out across the dark waters toward European airspace. Captain Brooklyn Viper Hayes occupied seat 14F in the economy cabin, wedged between a sleeping Army logistics officer and a young Marine who'd been nervously gripping his armrest since takeoff. She wore simple jeans and a dark blue Henley shirt, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her gray eyes focused on a paperback thriller from the airport bookstore. To the flight attendants moving through the cabin with beverage carts and practiced smiles, she looked like just another military officer heading overseas, probably a transport pilot or maybe an instructor at some training command. Nobody knew they were serving coffee to someone with 17 confirmed aerial victories, 3 distinguished flying crosses, and a classified mission record that made her legendary among elite fighter pilot communities worldwide. Brooklyn had checked in at the military terminal like everyone else, shown her orders and military ID, and answered standard security questions without mentioning her actual job. The gate agent had glanced at her credentials, seen the Air Force designation, and waved her through with board efficiency. Nobody at the check-in counter knew they were processing paperwork for an ace combat pilot who'd spent the last 8 years pushing F-22 Raptors through maneuvers that redefined air superiority tactics. The elderly woman across the aisle had asked earlier if she flew helicopters, making polite conversation, and Brooklyn had just smiled and said she flew jets, leaving it at that. The truth was Brooklyn Hayes had become something rare in modern military aviation, an honest-to-God ace in an era when most aerial victories happened beyond visual range with missiles fired from positions the enemy never saw coming. Her first 3 kills had come during a classified operation when she'd been jumped by enemy fighters while flying routine patrol, turning what should have been her death into a masterclass in dogfighting that left 3 enemy aircraft scattered across desert floor. The next 14 kills had accumulated over dozens of missions, each one a story of split-second decisions and aircraft handling that pushed both her and her F-22 past every normal operational limit. But nobody on Flight 447 knew any of that, and Brooklyn preferred it that way. Civilian travel meant escaping the weight of her reputation, avoiding questions and hero worship and requests to tell war stories she couldn't discuss because half her missions were classified above top secret. The young Marine next to her had asked what she did in the Air Force about an hour into the flight. Brooklyn had given him the simplified version, saying she was a fighter pilot, and he'd gotten excited and asked if she'd ever seen combat. She'd said yes, keeping it vague, and he'd launched into a story about his older brother who was an Air Force mechanic at Nellis. Brooklyn had listened politely while thinking about the irony that this kid's brother probably worked on the same F-22 she'd been flying for years. 3 hours into the flight, somewhere over the dark Atlantic with nothing but ocean in every direction, Brooklyn had finished her coffee and was deep into Chapter 12 when she heard the cockpit door open. She didn't look up initially, just registered the sound as part of normal flight operations. Then she heard a sharp gasp from the front cabin followed by raised voices that carried a tone she recognized immediately as panic barely controlled. Brooklyn closed her book and looked up, her combat instincts automatically assessing the situation. The cockpit door stood open, and she could see 2 flight attendants clustered in the galley area, one speaking urgently into the intercom while the other had her hand over her mouth. Passengers in forward cabin were starting to notice, craning their necks to see what was going on. Brooklyn felt that familiar sensation of time slowing down that always happened when situations went sideways. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, moving into the aisle with decisive action that made the Marine look up in surprise. Brooklyn walked toward the front cabin with purposeful strides, her mind already running through possibilities while her body moved on autopilot. She reached the galley just as the senior flight attendant, a man in his 40s with captain's stripes on his uniform, emerged from the cockpit with a face gone pale. He saw Brooklyn approaching and started to wave her back, but something in her expression made him pause. "I'm an Air Force pilot," Brooklyn said quietly, her voice carrying command authority. What's happening in there? The senior attendant glanced at his colleagues, then back at Brooklyn, making a split-second decision. Captain Mitchell collapsed at the controls, he said, keeping his voice low. The first officer called for medical assistance, but we need someone who can help fly this aircraft if the situation gets worse. Do you have commercial ratings? Brooklyn shook her head. Fighter pilot, not commercial, but I can fly anything with wings if you need me. How bad is he? Unconscious, possible heart attack or stroke, the attendant said, fear barely controlled despite his training. We've got a doctor working on him now, but the first officer says she needs help in the cockpit. We're over the middle of the Atlantic, still 3 hours from any diversion airport. Brooklyn processed this information the same way she processed threat assessments during combat operations, weighing options and calculating outcomes with speed that came from years of making life-or-death decisions at supersonic speeds. A Boeing 777 wasn't an F-22, but aircraft were aircraft, and fundamental principles of flight didn't change whether you were pulling 9GS in a dogfight or maintaining cruise altitude over ocean. Take me to the cockpit, Brooklyn said, and the senior attendant nodded with relief. The cockpit was cramped compared to fighter aircraft Brooklyn was used to, all screens and switches and overhead panels controlling systems far more complex than anything on a military jet. Captain Mitchell lay on the floor behind the seats, a middle-aged doctor kneeling beside him performing chest compressions while the first officer, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 30, struggled to maintain control while simultaneously calling for emergency assistance. The first officer looked up as Brooklyn entered, and for a moment their eyes met, and Brooklyn saw the same look she'd seen in young pilots during their first combat mission, that mixture of fear and determination. Air Force Captain Hayes, Brooklyn said, moving to the empty captain's seat. Fighter pilot F-22 Raptor, and I'm going to help you fly this bird until we figure out what's happening. The first officer, whose name tag read Collins, nodded sharply. Can you handle the radios while I fly? I need to talk to Gander Control and coordinate an emergency diversion, but I can't do that and maintain altitude and watch the captain all at once. Brooklyn slid into the captain's seat, her hands automatically finding controls and her eyes scanning the instrument panel with rapid assessment she'd done thousands of times in different cockpits. The 777's glass cockpit was state-of-the-art, all digital displays and fly-by-wire systems that weren't that different from what she flew in her F-22, just designed for hauling passengers instead of engaging enemy aircraft. She found the radio controls and keyed the mic with practiced efficiency. Gander Control, this is Global Atlantic 447, we have a medical emergency with the captain, requesting immediate assistance and possible diversion options. Brooklyn transmitted, her voice calm and professional. The response came back almost immediately, the air traffic controller's voice crackling through speakers with questions about their situation. Brooklyn coordinated with Collins, relaying information back and forth while keeping half her attention on aircraft systems. The situation was bad but manageable, right up until Brooklyn's trained ear caught something in the background radio chatter that made every combat instinct suddenly scream warnings. Gander, say again your last transmission, Brooklyn said, her voice sharpening. Global Atlantic 447, be advised we're tracking multiple unidentified aircraft approaching your position from the northeast, the controller said, tension creeping into his professional demeanor. Military assets are being notified, but you should be aware of potential traffic in your vicinity. Brooklyn's mind shifted into combat mode instantly. Unidentified aircraft over the Atlantic meant either major navigation error by someone else or something far worse, and the specific wording suggested this wasn't just a random airliner off course. She glanced at Collins, saw the first officer's confusion, and made a decision that would either save everyone or end her career. Collins, I need you to trust me right now, Brooklyn said, her voice carrying command authority from leading combat missions. Those unidentified aircraft aren't commercial traffic, and if they're who I think they are, we're about to have a much bigger problem than a medical emergency. Brooklyn's headset crackled with a new frequency, a military channel she recognized from countless combat operations. Global Atlantic 447, this is Raptor Control on secure frequency, do you copy? Brooklyn felt her heart rate spike as she switched to the encrypted military channel. Raptor Control was the call sign for the Air Force's Air Superiority Operations Center, the people who coordinated F-22 missions and managed aerial combat operations. They shouldn't have been talking to a commercial flight unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Raptor Control, this is Captain Hayes, currently assisting with aircraft operations on Global Atlantic 447, Brooklyn transmitted, using her operational call sign. What's the situation? The response came back with clipped urgency. Captain Hayes, Raptor Control confirms your identity and combat status. Be advised, you are tracking 4 hostile aircraft, believed to be advanced foreign fighters, approaching your position with hostile intent. Standard intercept procedures are compromised due to distance and response time. We have a situation that requires immediate action. Brooklyn's mind processed this with the speed of someone who'd spent years in aerial combat. Hostile aircraft approaching a commercial flight over the Atlantic meant either terrorist action or state-sponsored attack, and either option represented a level of international crisis that would dominate headlines for months. But the fact that Raptor Control was talking directly to her meant someone had made a calculation that conventional responses wouldn't work. Raptor Control, what are you asking me to do? Brooklyn said, though part of her already knew the answer. Captain Hayes, we have an F-22 Raptor airborne at your location, currently operating from the USS George Washington Battle Group conducting exercises 400 miles south of your position. Current tactical assessment indicates hostile aircraft will reach your position in approximately 18 minutes. And our nearest combat air patrol is 30 minutes out. We need someone in that Raptor who can handle an air-to-air engagement against advanced threats. You want me to transfer from this commercial aircraft to an F-22 while we're flying over the Atlantic, Brooklyn said. Captain Hayes, you're the only ace-rated pilot within range, and hostile aircraft are equipped with capabilities that exceed standard engagement protocols. The pilot currently flying the Alert Raptor is qualified but has no combat experience. You have 17 confirmed kills and tactical expertise that makes you the only viable option. We're asking you to do something that's never been attempted, but the alternative is allowing those hostile aircraft to reach a commercial flight carrying 300 civilians. Brooklyn looked at Collins, saw the first officer's face frozen in shocked confusion, then looked back at the instrument panel and made the kind of decision that separated people who thought about being heroes from people who actually were. Raptor Control, how exactly do you expect me to get from this 777 to an F-22 while we're both flying at altitude? We're vectoring the Raptor to your position now. The plan is to bring the F-22 alongside your aircraft, match speed and altitude, and have you transfer via emergency egress from the 777's overwing exit directly to the Raptor's cockpit using a modified aerial refueling approach. That's completely insane, Brooklyn said flatly. But even as she said it, her mind was already working through the physics and procedures. Yes, ma'am, it absolutely is. But you've done crazier things in combat and right now you're the only person who can pull this off. We have 18 minutes before those hostile aircraft reach range, and we need you in that Raptor in 15 minutes to have any chance of intercepting them. Brooklyn thought about the 317 passengers sitting in the cabin behind her, civilians and military personnel who had no idea their routine flight had just turned into the opening moves of an international incident. She thought about all the training and all the missions and all the impossible situations she'd survived by trusting her skills. Raptor Control, I'm going to need specific instructions for this transfer procedure, Brooklyn said, her voice steady. And somebody better have figured out how Collins is going to fly this 777 alone once I'm gone. Collins stared at her with an expression somewhere between terror and awe. And Brooklyn gave her the kind of reassuring smile she'd given countless young pilots before sending them into combat. You're going to be fine. The autopilot will handle the heavy lifting, and you've got controllers on the ground who will talk you through every step. Brooklyn moved out of the captain's seat and headed back into the cabin. The senior flight attendant met her at the galley, confusion on his face. Brooklyn pulled him aside and spoke quietly. I need you to prepare the left overwing emergency exit for opening at altitude. Don't ask questions, don't tell the passengers anything except that we're conducting an emergency procedure, and make absolutely sure nobody else comes near that exit once it's opened. The attendant stared at her. Captain, opening an emergency exit at 39,000 feet would depressurize the cabin. The military is coordinating this operation. They're going to adjust cabin pressure protocols remotely through the aircraft systems, and I'm the only person who can do what needs to be done next. You have to trust me. Something in Brooklyn's eyes convinced him. He nodded slowly and moved toward the emergency equipment. Brooklyn continued down the aisle toward her seat, retrieved her duffel bag and moved back toward the overwing exit where the flight attendant was already clearing passengers from surrounding rows. Brooklyn's headset crackled with updates. Captain Hayes, the F-22 is approaching your position now, 60 seconds to visual contact. The pilot will match your speed and altitude, positioning approximately 50 feet off your left wing. You'll have a 30-second window to make the transfer once the cabin is ready. 50 feet between two aircraft traveling at 500 miles per hour at 39,000 feet. Brooklyn had pulled off impossible maneuvers in combat, but this was different. This wasn't combat flying where she had controls and engines. This was just her body and her timing and her absolute faith that the people coordinating this knew what they were doing. The flight attendant had cleared space around the emergency exit. Brooklyn positioned herself next to it, her duffel bag strapped across her back, her mind running through the sequence of actions she'd need to execute perfectly. Through the cabin window, she caught her first glimpse of the F-22 Raptor sliding into position alongside the 777, its angular stealth profile unmistakable, its pilot holding formation with precision that came from countless hours of aerial refueling training. Captain Hayes, we're initiating cabin pressure equalization now. You'll feel the pressure change in 30 seconds. Once stable, you'll have the green light to open the exit. The Raptor pilot has extended a modified rescue cable that you'll clip to your harness. The transfer will take approximately 15 seconds. Copy all, Raptor Control, Brooklyn said. Standing by for pressure equalization. The cabin pressure shifted, a subtle change that made her ears pop and drew alarmed murmurs from nearby passengers. The overhead lights flickered as the aircraft's systems adjusted to military override commands. Captain Hayes, your green light for exit opening. May the wind be at your back. Brooklyn pulled the emergency exit handle, and the overwing hatch blew outward with explosive force immediately tempered by pressure equalization. Wind screamed into the cabin with a roar that drowned out passengers' shouts, and Brooklyn moved without hesitation. She stepped through the opening onto the 777's wing, the slipstream trying to rip her away immediately, her hands finding the modified cable that stretched from the F-22's open cockpit. The world became wind and noise and terrible knowledge that she was standing on the wing of a Boeing 777 at 39,000 feet. Brooklyn clipped the safety line to her harness with hands that moved automatically, then she jumped, pushing off from the 777's wing with perfect timing. 15 seconds of pure terror as the cable pulled her across the gap, the F-22's angular cockpit growing larger while wind tried to tear her apart. Brooklyn's combat training kicked in automatically, her body positioning itself for impact, her hands reaching for the Raptor's cockpit edge. She grabbed the reinforced handholds, pulled herself up and over, and dropped into the rear cockpit position behind the stunned F-22 pilot. Get us out of here. Brooklyn shouted over wind noise, pulling the canopy closed. We've got hostile aircraft inbound and about 12 minutes to intercept. The F-22 pilot, whose name tag read Lieutenant Chin, pushed the throttles forward without wasting time on questions. The Raptor's twin engines responded with thrust that pressed Brooklyn back into her seat with familiar force. The commercial airliner fell away behind them as Chin climbed toward combat altitude. Captain Hayes, Raptor Control confirms your successful transfer. Lieutenant Chin is a qualified F-22 pilot but has no combat experience. You're taking tactical command of this intercept. Current hostile position is bearing 045, range 200 nautical miles, altitude 45,000 feet, speed Mach 1.2. We assess 4 aircraft, likely Su-57 felons based on radar signature. Brooklyn felt ice water replace adrenaline as she processed that. Su-57 felons were Russia's answer to the F-22, advanced stealth fighters that represented genuine threat to American air superiority. 4 of them operating over the Atlantic meant someone had decided to make a very aggressive statement. Chin, I'm taking front seat, Brooklyn said. You're going to slide back and handle weapon systems and defensive countermeasures. I'll fly and fight, you keep us alive. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am, Chin said, and Brooklyn heard the mixture of fear and excitement in his voice. The position swap was awkward but manageable, and within 30 seconds Brooklyn had her hands on the flight controls, feeling the aircraft respond like an extension of her own body. The familiarity was instant and comforting, all the muscle memory from thousands of hours making her movements smooth and precise. Raptor Control, Viper is front seat and tactical lead, Brooklyn transmitted, using her combat call sign. Chin is weapons and defensive systems. Give me full tactical picture and rules of engagement. Viper, hostile aircraft are maintaining course toward commercial flight's last known position. We assess they're hunting for Global Atlantic 447, likely intending to force it down or destroy it. Rules of engagement are weapons-free once hostile intent is confirmed. Brooklyn processed this while configuring her displays and checking weapon status. The F-22 carried a full combat load, 6 AIM-120 AMRAAMs for beyond visual range engagement and 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders for close-in fighting, plus her 20mm cannon. Against 4 Su-57s the odds weren't great, but odds had never mattered much when Brooklyn was flying. Chin, configure radar for long-range search, Brooklyn said. I want continuous updates on hostile positions. If they light us up with targeting radar, I need to know immediately. Copy that, Chin said, and Brooklyn heard him working through systems with methodical efficiency. The F-22 accelerated toward supersonic speed, its twin engines producing thrust that made the aircraft feel alive. Brooklyn flew with aggressive confidence that came from knowing exactly what the Raptor could do and exactly how far she could push it. The hostile aircraft appeared on her displays as 4 radar contacts maintaining close formation, still heading toward the commercial flight's position, apparently unaware they were about to have a very bad day. Viper, hostile aircraft are climbing through 50,000 feet and accelerating to Mach 1.4, Raptor control transmitted. They're definitely hunting. Recommend caution and engagement. Brooklyn smiled grimly inside her helmet. Caution was for people who didn't have 17 confirmed kills and a reputation for turning impossible situations into victory. She adjusted her intercept vector, positioning the F-22 to come at hostile aircraft from below and behind, using the Raptor's stealth capabilities to close distance before the Su-57s knew they had company. The range decreased steadily as Brooklyn closed the gap, using every trick of modern stealth technology to remain invisible. The Su-57s maintained their course, apparently confident and unaware of the predators stalking them. Brooklyn watched the range counter tick down, calculating firing solutions with tactical awareness that made her one of the best combat pilots alive. Viper, you are at optimal firing range for AMRAAM engagement, Raptor control transmitted. Hostile aircraft are now within 50 miles of commercial flight's projected position. You are cleared weapons hot. Brooklyn's fingers moved to weapons release, selecting her first 2 AMRAAMs and locking targeting systems on the 2 lead Su-57s. The missiles would launch from stealth, flying ballistic profiles until terminal guidance activated, giving hostile aircraft precious seconds to react once they realized they were under attack. Chin, stand by for missile launch, Brooklyn said, her voice carrying the calm of someone who'd done this too many times to count. We're taking the lead 2 aircraft first, then maneuvering for follow-up shots. Standing by, Chin confirmed. Brooklyn pressed weapons release, and the F-22 shuddered slightly as 2 AMRAAMs dropped away and ignited, accelerating toward their targets at speeds that made physics seem optional. The missiles appeared on her displays as friendly tracks reaching out toward hostile aircraft that still had no idea they were in a fight. Viper, missiles tracking nominal, Raptor control transmitted. Impact in 20 seconds. Brooklyn maintained her course, watching the tactical display while her hands stayed ready for violent maneuvering that would come next. She'd learned this lesson in her first dogfight and every subsequent engagement, waiting for that moment when geometry and physics align to turn your attack into the enemy's disaster. Hostile aircraft are reacting, Chin shouted. Radar shows hard defensive breaks. Brooklyn saw it on her displays, the 4 Su-57s breaking formation in explosive defensive maneuvers that scattered them across the sky. But training in aircraft didn't matter when missiles were already tracking. Viper, splash 1. Raptor control called out. First hostile confirmed destroyed. Second hostile is, splash 2. Both lead aircraft down. Brooklyn didn't waste time celebrating. She rolled the F-22 into a hard diving turn, accelerating toward the 2 remaining Su-57s while they were still processing the loss of their flight leads. The hostile pilots would be confused, disoriented, trying to figure out where the attack had come from. Brooklyn intended to use that confusion to end this fight. Chin, select next 2 AMRAAMs and lock targets, Brooklyn ordered, pulling the Raptor through a high G-turn. I want simultaneous launch as soon as we have acquisition. Locking now, Chin said, his voice tight with G-forces but focused. The remaining Su-57s had split apart, trying to create separation, but Brooklyn had anticipated this exact maneuver. She adjusted her flight path, keeping both hostile aircraft in her firing solution while maintaining energy advantage from diving out of higher altitude. The geometry was perfect. Targets locked. Chin called out. Ready for launch. Fox 3, Fox 3. Brooklyn transmitted as she sent 2 more missiles racing toward hostile aircraft. The Su-57 saw the launches this time, their defensive systems detecting the F-22's radar emissions during targeting, and both hostile pilots broke hard in opposite directions trying to defeat incoming missiles. Brooklyn pushed the Raptor into a vertical climb, using the aircraft's incredible thrust-to-weight ratio to maintain energy while watching her missiles track. One Su-57 attempted a complex defensive pattern, dispensing chaff and flares while executing violent jinking maneuvers. The other hostile pilot made a critical mistake, braking toward Brooklyn's position instead of away. Splash 3. Raptor control confirmed. Third hostile destroyed. Fourth hostile is maneuvering toward your position. Brooklyn saw the last Su-57 coming at her head-on, closing at combined speed that made reaction times measure in fractions of seconds. The hostile pilot had committed to a gun solution, apparently figuring if he was going to die anyway he might as well try to take the American fighter with him. "Chin, I'm going to pass him close aboard," Brooklyn said. "When I call it, activate all countermeasures and be ready for violent maneuvering." "Ready?" Chin acknowledged. The two fighters closed on each other like medieval justers, both pilots committed to their attack runs. Brooklyn waited until the last possible moment, letting the Su-57's pilot think he had a firing solution. Then she broke hard right and pulled the Raptor through an impossible turn that used every pound of available thrust. The hostile pilot tried to bring his guns to bear, but Brooklyn had already reversed her turn and come around inside his radius, putting her F-22 behind the Su-57 in perfect tail-chase position. "Countermeasures now," Brooklyn shouted, and Chin flooded the sky with flares and chaff. Brooklyn selected her last two AMRAAMs and fired both at point-blank range, less than a mile separating the two aircraft. The Su-57 pilot never had a chance to react before both missiles impacted his aircraft and turned the advanced Russian fighter into an expanding fireball. Splash 4. Brooklyn transmitted, pulling away from the explosion. "All hostile aircraft destroyed, area is clear." "Viper, Raptor control confirms all 4 hostile aircraft destroyed," the controller's voice came back, amazement in his tone despite professional demeanor. "That was 4 kills in approximately 90 seconds. Outstanding work." Brooklyn took a deep breath, letting adrenaline start to fade. 4 more kills added to her record, bringing her total to 21 confirmed aerial victories. But the numbers didn't matter right now, not when there was still a commercial flight full of civilians that needed protection. "Raptor control, what's the status of Global Atlantic 447? Brooklyn asked. "Global Atlantic 447 is maintaining course under First Officer Collins's control. They're being vectored toward Lodge's Field in the Azores for emergency landing. Captain Mitchell is stable but still unconscious, and Collins is handling the aircraft like a professional. Your transfer maneuver probably saved 300 lives today, Viper." The F-22 rendezvoused with Global Atlantic 447 20 minutes later, sliding into escort position off the commercial flight's wing. Brooklyn maintained her position, providing reassurance through her presence and ready to respond to any further threats. The landing at Lodge's Field happened without incident, Collins bringing the 777 down in a textbook arrival. Emergency medical teams rushed to the aircraft as soon as it stopped, taking Captain Mitchell to the base hospital. Brooklyn landed the F-22 30 minutes after the commercial flight touched down, taxiing to a secure ramp area where a reception committee of senior military officers waited. She climbed down from the Raptor's cockpit feeling every minute of the last several hours, her legs slightly unsteady, her mind still processing everything. A 3-star general named Morrison approached her, his face showing carefully controlled amazement. He stopped in front of Brooklyn and just stared at her for a moment before finding his voice. "Captain Hayes, I've been in the Air Force for 32 years, and I have never seen anything like what you just pulled off," Morrison said, shaking his head slowly. "Jumping from a commercial airliner to a fighter jet and then engaging 4 hostile aircraft in combat? That's the kind of thing that's going to be in history books." Brooklyn straightened to attention despite her exhaustion. "Just doing my job, sir." "Your job is flying F-22s, not performing aerial circus acts that should be physically impossible," Morrison said, but there was warmth in his voice. "Although I suppose when you're an ace with 17 kills, 21 kills now, we should probably expect the impossible from you on a regular basis." The story of Captain Brooklyn Viper Hayes became part of Air Force lore, taught to new pilots as an example of what was possible with the right combination of skill, courage, and commitment to mission. Her 21 confirmed kills made her one of the highest-scoring aces in modern aviation history, but it was the manner of her victories that captured imagination and inspired a generation of young aviators. The mid-air transfer from commercial flight to F-22 was studied in tactical courses as an example of creative problem-solving under pressure, even though everyone acknowledged it was something that should probably never be attempted again. Brooklyn continued flying and mentoring young pilots, always emphasizing that being a great fighter pilot wasn't about being fearless but about managing fear and making good decisions under pressure, the building blocks that allowed pilots to handle unexpected situations with confidence and turn impossible moments into victories that would be remembered for generations.